All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to jump right in and unpack a massive corporate heist that was, believe it or not, hiding in plain sight. Now, we usually think of fraud as this dark, shadowy thing, right? Like forged signatures, missing briefcases of money, that sort of thing. But what if I told you that some of the absolute most sophisticated frauds in manufacturing happen right out in the open? We're talking fully documented, signed off on by management kind of open. Today, we're dissecting a totally fascinating case study about contract labor management, and it's a wild story of payroll fraud, duplicate billing, and active collusion. We're calling it the shape-shifting workforce.
Okay, let's dive into this. In the world of contract labor, you'd probably think perfectly matched paperwork is, the ultimate goal, a real win. But as we're going to see today, in this space, perfect paperwork is actually often the very first symptom of orchestrated deceit. When every single document aligns flawlessly, well, it's sometimes because someone engineered it exactly that way, just to pass a specific type of audit.
To really get this, let's compare two totally different approaches to risk management. On one hand, you've got your traditional standard desk auditor. Now, this approach is super siloed. When they review a manpower payout, they basically just check that the work order quantity matches the system entry. They tally that with gate attendance and call it a day. They absolutely do not cross-reference labor law compliances during that check. That's done by a totally different department in a totally different cycle. And for output-based contracts, they literally just verify if a plant engineer signed off, period. But then, on the other hand, you have the Aegile Auditor. This approach, it doesn't care about departmental silos. It operates at a macro level, using analytics to look at the whole shebang, the entire contractor ecosystem all at once.
The danger of that first method, the traditional desk auditing, is that it creates what we call the illusion of perfection. Because everything is so isolated, every signature matches perfectly in its own little vacuum. Accounts Payable checks their list, perfect. Statutory compliance checks theirs, perfect. The controls get marked as effective, and the money goes out the door. But keeping these functions separated creates this massive, dangerous, false sense of security. It's exactly like looking at two puzzle pieces through a microscope and never realizing they actually belong to completely different puzzles.
Section 1. Cracking the case and the analytic pivot. Because to shatter that illusion of perfection, the auditor had to step back and test the physical reality of the business environment itself.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how beautifully simple the analytic test actually was. The auditor built a script mapping the total value of work performed against the total manpower supplied, basically the physical attendance at the security gate. They cross-referenced that with the manual mandate estimates and the government labor returns, and the results, glaring. While most contractors were completely normal, 4 specific vendors popped up as massive statistical outliers. I mean, they were seemingly producing a literally impossible amount of output for the tiny headcount they were officially supplying.
And that discovery right there triggers a huge investigative principle. We call it the no sample from a sample rule. Basically, if analytics flag a vendor as a high-risk outlier, you don't just pull a few more random invoices to check. Actually, scratch that. You stop looking at random samples entirely. Instead, every single activity, every contract, every enterprise-wide touchpoint for that vendor gets reviewed. Everything gets pulled into one unified, cross-departmental view.
Section 2. The heist and the shape-shifting workforce. Let's look at how this highly organized double-dipping operation actually played out on the factory floor.
So the investigation uncovered this massive double-dipping scheme. It all came down to one vendor holding concurrent contracts in totally different sections of the same facility. Here's the setup. The vendor had Contract X, a Manpower Supply contract in Section A. That's time and material, meaning you get paid based on headcount and hours. Concurrently, they had Contract Y in Section B, which was a work-based contract. That one is fixed price. You get paid per unit of output regardless of how many people do the job. The contractor essentially weaponized the massive physical size of the plant. They bet on the fact that administration, stuck in their desk audit silos, would never ever cross-reference a headcount contract in Section A with an output contract all the way over in Section B. Let's move to and see how this builds throughout a typical day, because the mechanics are brilliantly simple. At 8 a.m., the workers punch in at the main gate and get manually allocated to Section A. Boom, the daily wage clock for Contract X starts ticking. But then, right around 9 a.m., the contractor secretly diverts a huge chunk of those exact same workers away from Section A, marching them across the plant over to Section B. Why? To crank out the output tasks for Contract Y.
The sheer audacity here is just wild. The plant was literally paying twice for the exact same pool of humans.
First, paying a daily attendance wage just for them swiping in at the gate, and then paying a premium for the physical units those same people were building over in Section B. Now you might be thinking, how on earth do dozens of workers migrate across a huge plant unnoticed? Well, the investigation proved that the engineer in charge was actively colluding with the vendor. This engineer was purposely signing off on manipulated manpower sheets to give them the operational cover they needed to pull this off.
Section 3, Anatomy of a Failure. How did this happen? We know the mechanics of the crime, but we need to figure out what root causes and system deficiencies let this happen in the first place.
So the crucial point is that this fraud thrived on structural blind spots. First, the ERP, billing, and compliance systems were totally isolated. Different departments were accepting the exact same labor returns without realizing it was the same human resource pool. Second, there was a huge disconnect between the gate and the shop floor. Attendance was only checked at the perimeter. Once inside, zero tracking. Third, no visual ID for work zones. A worker from Section A could stroll right into Section B and nobody would bat an eye. And finally, because of siloed document verification, the vendor could literally just photocopy their statutory labor returns and hand them over to multiple different departments to justify their headcount.
Section 4, Building the Ultimate Defense. Process engineering. Because understanding the failure is only half the battle. Now we need to engineer structural solidity. Obviously, you do the immediate stuff. Terminate the contractor, sue to recover the duplicate payouts, and take massive disciplinary action against that colluding engineer. But here is the golden rule of risk management. You can't just fire the fraudster, you have to fix the factory. If you don't actually engineer out these vulnerabilities, another contractor is just going to step right in tomorrow and exploit those exact same loopholes.
And this brilliantly illustrates how we actually build those structural fixes. First, they totally overhauled the ID cards with visual and smart ID architecture. Cards now have to explicitly show the contract name, assigned section, and job role, and they are strictly color-coded by subplant. If a guard sees a blue-badged worker in a red-badged zone, it's instantly obvious they shouldn't be there. Second, they made holistic vendor auditing a permanent institutional rule. No more siloed checking. And finally, cross-system document locking. This is huge. Now, statutory returns are system-mapped to the total unique headcount supplied by a vendor across the entire enterprise. It mathematically blocks the exact same document from being attached to multiple different billing files. Game changer.
Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. We've seen just how incredibly dangerous desk-based auditing can be and why truly understanding your physical business environment is absolutely the ultimate control test. So I'll leave you with this to chew on for your own operations. Are your perfectly matched compliance records actually hiding a shape-shifting workforce? Because as we've learned, in a siloed system, perfection is usually just an illusion. Thanks for joining me today. Keep asking those tough questions, keep looking beyond the paperwork, and keep learning.